Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to Sefiruz. My name is Muhammad Sarabi Hamzah. I'm from S2291B. My groupmate and I will be presenting about difference and similarities between ISO 90001, ISO 40001, and ISO 45001. I will be presenting about subclause 4.0 until 6.2. Okay, for class 4, uh, the title is context of the organization, and for class 4.1, the is about understanding the organization and context. This is all the same for each. Next is class 4.2, which is about understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. The contexts are the same for these three standards, but the only difference is about the aspect, which is about quality management, environmental management, and OHS management. Next is class 4.3. It's all the same for these three standards, which is about determine the scope of each management system. For ISO 90001 is about quality, for ISO 40001 is about environmental, and for ISO 45001 it's about OHS. For class 4.4, the difference is only for ISO 90001 because it's about quality management system and process. But for ISO 45001 and ISO 45001, it's about environmental management system and oceanus management system. It explains about the target and objective. But for 90001, it have a few subclasses. The subclause for class 4.4 for quality management system in and its process in ISO 9001 are about 4.4.1, which is organization shall establish, implement, and maintain and continually improve a quality management system. For 4.4.2, which is about to context to the extent necessary, the organization shall maintain and retain documented information. For clause 5, the context are about leadership. It is the same for these three standards. And for class 5.1, leadership and commitment. For ISO 40001 and ISO 45001 are the same, but for ISO 90001, it has a few subclasses. Class 5.2 are the same for ISO 40001 and ISO 45001 because it's about policy for each aspect, which is environmental and oceanus. But for ISO 90001, it's only about policy, and it has two subclasses, which is 5.2.1 and 5.2.2. Subclasses 5.2.1 is about establishing the quality policy, and subclasses 5.2.2 is communicating the quality policy. 5.2.1 is are the same as 5.2 for ISO 40001 and 45001. Class 5.3 are the same for these three standards, which is about organization rules, responsibilities, and authorities. It is about type management shall ensure that the responsibilities and authorities for relevant rules are assigned and communicate within the organization. The next class is 5.4. 5.4 only have in ISO 45001, which is about consultation and participation of workers. This is about the organization shall establish and implement and maintain process for consultation and participation of workers at all applicable level and functions. Clause 6, which is planning, and clause 6.1, which is actions to address risks and opportunities, are the same for these three standards. For subclause 6.1.1 is about the general, but for ISO 90001 there is no title, which is the general, like ISO 40001 and ISO 45001, but the contexts are the same, which is about to giving the assurance that each management system can achieve at its intended outcome, prevent or reduce undesired effects, and achieve continual improvement. For clause 6.1.2, these three standards have three different contexts. For ISO 9001, which is this is about actions to address these risks and opportunities and how to integrate and implement and evaluate. For ISO 40001, it's about environmental aspects, and for ISO 45001, it is about hazard identification and assessment of risks and opportunities, and it has a few subclasses. For clause 6.1.2, ISO 45001 have three subclasses, which is 6.1.2.1 are about hazard identifications, 6.1.2.2 which is assessment of OH&S risks and other risks to the OH&S management system, and 6.1.2.3 which is about assessment of OH&S opportunities and other opportunities to the for the OH&S management system. Clause 6.1.3, only ISO 90001 didn't have this clause, but for ISO 40001, it is about compliance obligations, and for ISO 45001, it's about determination of legal requirements and other requirements. Next is clause 6.1.4, which is only available for ISO 45001. It is about planning action that the organization shall plan action to address risks, opportunities, legal requirements, and other requirements, and how to evaluate the effectiveness of this action and implement the action into its OHS management system. For the title, for the class 6.2, which is about objective and planning to achieve them. These are the same for each standard, but the difference is about quality, environmental, and OHS. Okay, for class 6.2.1, these three standards are the same because it is to consistent with the each policy, measurable, monitored, and communicate and update as appropriate.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. I'm Nazifa Naswa binti Muhammad. So today I'm going to talk about the difference and similarity between three ISO, which is ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and ISO 9001. So for clause 6.2.2, all ISO are different. For ISO 9001, it determines where, what, and who. While for the ISO 14001, planning action to achieve environmental objective, and ISO 45001 is planning action to achieve OH and S object. For clause 6.3, only for ISO 9001, which is planning of changes. For clause 7.1, all the ISOs state the same resources and support except for the ISO 9001, which is more specific. So for ISO 14001, the organization provide the support and resources for the continual improvement of EMS, while for ISO 45001, the resources and support are provided to the continual improvement of the OHS management system. The specific support and resources that I mentioned earlier from ISO 19001 is general, which is 7.1.1. The general is the organization shall consider what need to be obtained from the external provider. Then 7.2.1 is about the people. The organization need to determine and provide the person for the effective implementation of the quality management system. Then 7.1.2 is about the infrastructure. So organization should provide and maintain the infrastructure which is necessary for the operation. And then 7.1.4 is about the environmental for the operation of process should be maintained and provided by the organization for the operation. Clause 7.1.5.1 and clause 7.1.5.2 is contained only in ISO 9001, which is the organization. So the organization shall ensure the resources provided are suitable for the specific type, maintain and retain the appropriate documented information as evidence, while the clause 7.1.5.2 is about the measurement. So traceability, which is measuring equipment. Clause 7.1.6 is about the organizational knowledge. So the organization need to determine the current knowledge necessary for the operation of its process. And then for clause 7.2, state all the ISO state the same competence, but ISO 14001 the necessary work under its control that affect the environmental performance, while ISO 45001 is the necessary competence of worker that affect OH and S performance. So all this information regarding this clause must be documented. For clause 7.3, all the three ISO state the same awareness, which is the worker need to aware about the policy and objective of the ISO. But for ISO 45001 has include additional implication which says specify safety measure which is hazard and risk. And then for clause 7.4 communication, only for ISO 9001, which is determine the internal and external communication that is relevant to the quality management system. Clause 7.4.1, which is general, only state by the ISO 14001, which is internal and external communication are relevant to the EMS, and ISO 45001, which is internal and external information and communication relevant to the OH and S management system. For clause 7.4.2 is contained only for ISO 14001, which is internal communication information relevant to the EMS, and for ISO 45001, which is internal communication information relevant to the OH and S management system. For clause 7.4.3 is also stated by ISO 14001, which is the external communication information relevant to the EMS, and ISO 45001 is the external communication information are relevant to the OH and S management system. We move to the 7.5, which is all these three ISO is documented information. For clause 7.5.1 is all the ISO state the same general, which is documented information required and documented information determined by organization as being necessary.
Assalamualaikum to Sir Fairuz. My name is Nur Fadila binti Supardi, and for my part, I will be presenting on the subclause 7.5.2 until subclause 8.3.4. So for subclause 7.5.2, we can see that all the three ISO standards have the same title, which is creating and updating, as well as the same requirement whereby the organization must ensure appropriate identification and description, format, and review and approval for suitability and adequacy. Moving on to subclause 7.5.3, the similarities between the ISO standard is that they have the same title, which is the control of documented information. Even though ISO 9001 has two other subclauses, which are 7.5.3.1 and 7.5.3.2, all these ISO standards have the same requirement, which is they have the same reasons to control, such as to ensure availability and protection, and the same activities needed to be addressed as applicable, such as distribution, storage and preservation, and many more. The only difference is that ISO 9001 requires documented information retained as evidence of conformity must be protected from unintended alteration. Moving on to clause 8, all the ISO standards have the same title, which is operation. For subclause 8.1, all three ISO standards also have the same title, which is operational planning and control. For ISO 9001 and 14001, the difference is that ISO 9001 has to plan, implement, and control, But for 14001, it has to establish, implement, control, and maintain the processes needed according to their respective clauses and subclauses. Besides, only ISO 14001 has to be consistent with lifecycle perspective, while ISO 45001 doesn't state any requirement in this subclause. Next, in this subclause, only ISO 45001's 8.1 subclause is expanded into several more subclauses, which are 8.1.1 the general, whereby the requirement is quite the same as that of other standards, in which the organization must plan, implement, control, and maintain the processes needed. Then, 8.1.2 eliminating hazards and reducing occupational health and safety risks, and 8.1.3 the management of change. And lastly, 8.1.4 procurement, which further extended into several subclauses, which are 8.1.4.1 general, 8.1.4.2 contractors, and 8.1.4.3 outsourcing. All these subclauses have their own requirements as shown here. Moving on to subclause 8.2, as seen, both ISO 14001 and 45001 have the same title, which is Emergency Preparedness and Response. They have one similar requirement, which is the organization has to establish, implement, maintain the processes needed according to their respective subclauses like shown here. However, the difference in the other requirement is that ISO 14001 must maintain documented information to have confidence. But for ISO 45001, the organization has to maintain and retain documented information on the processes and plans. Also for the difference, only ISO 9001 has different title for this subclause, which is requirements for products and services, and is further extended into several more subclauses. The first subclause is that 8.2.1, which is the customer communication, where all the requirements are shown above. Next subclause is 8.2.2, determining the requirements for products and services. 8.2.3, review of requirements for products and services, which further divided into two subclauses, which are 8.2.3.1 and 8.2.3.2. And lastly, 8.2.4, which is the changes to requirements for products and services. As shown here, these are the requirements of each subclause that other standards do not have. Moving on to subclause 8.3. As said before, only ISO 9001 has this subclause, which is design and development of products and services. Subclause 8.3 is further explained in 8.3.1 the general, where organization must establish, implement, and maintain a design and development process. Next, 8.3.2, the design and development planning, where organization has to determine the stages and controls for design and development, considering all the requirements shown here. Then, 8.3.3, design and development inputs, where organization has to determine the essential requirements while considering all these obligatory requirements stated above. Lastly, 8.3.4, design and development controls, where organization must apply controls to the design and development process to ensure these following requirements are met. All these requirements, starting from 8.2.1 until 8.3.4, are only required in ISO 9001 and not in those two other standards.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. I am Shafiqa binti Sham. I would like to present subclauses 8.3.5 until 8.7.1, which only for ISO 19001. So for subclauses 8.3.5, the organization shall ensure that the design and development outputs meet the requirement and also suitable for the following processes, which include the monitoring and measuring specify the characteristic of products and services. Next, for subclauses 8.3.6, the organization shall identify, review, control changes of the design and development of product and services, which also have to maintain the documented information of the result of review, the authorization changes, and the action taken to prevent adverse impact. For subclasses 8.4.1, they have to control the externally provided processes, products and services to confirm the requirement. And it also determines the applied criteria for the evaluation and selection monitoring performance for external provider. For subclasses at 0.4.2, the type and extent of control. The organization shall ensure the externally provided processes is remain controlled, and the organization also should define the controls applied to an external provider and the resulting output. Organization shall take consideration to the potential impact and effectiveness of an external providers. For subclasses at 0.4.3, it is the information for external providers. The organization shall communicate to the external providers for the process of the products and services to be provided. And the most important thing that it should take the approval and the validation activities for the processes and products services. Process at 0.5.1, it is the control of production and services provision. The criteria of products and services must be at the appropriate stage, and the use of the suitable infrastructure and environment should be considered too. Also, the implementation of action of the release and the delivery and post-delivery have to be monitored to prevent human error. For subclasses at 0.5.2, it is the identification and the traceability. The organization shall identify the status of output with respect to the monitoring and the measurement of requirements. Next, subclasses at 0.5.3, it is the property belonging to customers or external providers. Organization shall care for customers' belonging and report the loss, damage, or unsuitable property for customers. Every incident happen should be kept in a documented form. For the preservation, the organization shall preserve the output of production. Next, for subclasses at 0.5.5, the post-delivery activities, the organization shall consider in determining the statutory and the regulatory requirement, and the most important thing is the customer feedback to improve the service and product from the organization. For subclasses at 0.5.6, it is the control changes. They have to review the document, also the person authorizing. Next, the release of products and services. The organization shall implement plan arrangement which has the satisfactory completed. Also consider the documented information about the evidence with the acceptance criteria. For subclasses at 0.7.1, organization shall do correction, inform the customers and verify the conformity after the output was corrected. Lastly, for subclasses at 0.7.2, the organization shall describe the non-conformity. After that, they should take appropriate action.
Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to Virus. My name is Siti Alfa Nasuha binti Madesa, and I will be presenting class 9 from class 10. From class 9, performance evaluation, the subclass first is 9.1, which is monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation, which means the organization must establish, implement and maintain a process for monitoring, measurement, analysis and performance evaluation. They must determine what needs to be monitored or measured. What is shown above is clause 9.1.1, which is monitoring and evaluation for ISO 14001 and 45001. 1.2, there is difference between ISO 90001 compared to 40001 and 45001, which is 9001 is customer satisfaction, while 40001 and 45001 is evaluation of compliance. Next subclause is 9.1.3, which is analysis and evaluation, where the organization must evaluate the conformity of products, level of customer satisfaction and performance, effectiveness, and the need of improvement. Clause 9.2, internal audit. There are three similarities for these three standards ISO, which is the organization must conform to organization own requirement of quality management system and requirement of the internal standard and effectively implemented and maintained. For the subclause 9.2.2, which is internal audit program, they must establish, implement, and maintain internal audit program by define the audit criteria and scope for each audit. Clause 9.3 Management Review. The organization shall review the organization environmental management system at the interval to ensure its sustainability, adequacy, and effectiveness. This is the continuous for the management review for ISO 40001 and 45001. Moving to clauses 9.3.2. For ISO 19001, this is management review inputs where the organization considers status of action, change in internals, and performance and effectiveness. For the outputs, the organization must review decision and actions of opportunities, changes needed, resources needed, and written document information. Next, clauses 10, improvement, where the organization determine and select opportunities to enhance the performance of their environmental management system. Into clauses 10.2, which is non-conformity and corrective action, the organization evaluate the need for action to eliminate and prevent the non-conformity from happening. The organization must review the effectiveness of any action taken. Subclause, which is continual improvement, where the organization must continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of their management system.